Very much for joining us. My name is Jack Stilgoe. I am at University College London, and I will be chairing today's webinar. We're here for an hour. We will have two presentations of bits of work from the Public Voices in AI project, and plenty of time for questions. I hope it's okay if everybody can use the Q&A function down at the bottom there in your Zoom window, and I will make sure that those questions get to the relevant person. I'm going to ask our two presenters to talk for about 15-20 minutes each, presenting some of the work that we did as part of the Public Voices in AI project. Just to give a little bit of context before I do, I'm going to ask Susan first and then Cian. But I should just say a little bit about the Public Voices in AI project, which came out of a bigger program called the Responsible AI program that I'm a member of the team of, funded by the British Research Councils. The Public Voices in AI project, if we could have that slide again, Susan, you're in charge of the slide, thank you. The Public Voices in AI project was really in recognition of the fact that when it comes to conversations about artificial intelligence, I think we can all recognize that there are a few loud voices that dominate the discussion. Those are the loud voices often of the people trying to sell AI, or of scientists and other experts who are dominating the discussion about what AI is. I also think we've recognized that AI is going to be a hugely important set of technologies and ideas, and that if it is consequential for shaping our futures, there's a sort of democratic question of how we involve ordinary people in discussions and decisions about the technology. So that's what we were trying to do with the Public Voices in AI project. In other webinars, we've been talking about streams of work that we did as part of that project, including a large public survey. This public survey was actually featured in a news piece in The Guardian yesterday, which was about government plans to create an artificial intelligence bill, an act of parliament that would regulate the technology. Today, though, we are going to be talking about two other pieces of work. So we did a lot of work on trying to understand what the public think by doing our own survey. The two pieces of work that we're going to be talking about today, first of all, an evidence review that Susan Oman is going to present, and then we're going to be talking about a survey that we ran of getting the views of more than 4,000 AI researchers themselves, trying to understand what the people at the coalface of the science and technology think. So with that in mind, what I would like you all to do as participants as we're going along, please do put your questions into the Q&A box as we're going along. I'll make sure the presenters are fed those questions once they're done. I will give Susan and Cian 15-20 minutes each, and then we'll have plenty of time to discuss all of those things. Susan, before you crack on, is there anything that important that I've missed about the mechanics of the project?
I don't think so. I think that's a great intro. Thanks, Jack.
In which case, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, so as Jack's introduced, I'm going to be talking about work from an evidence review that we did on Public Voices in AI, where we reviewed 320 pieces of evidence. I'm going to do some work explaining what those pieces of evidence were, how we did the review, what we found, but also today I'm really delighted to launch the webtoon that emerged from this piece of work, that was designed by the artist Kitty McEwen, who's here somewhere, and will be available to answer questions at the end, should anyone want to ask Kitty questions about this. So what was interesting, one of the key things that we did on the Public Voices in AI project was we worked really closely with something called the People's Panel in AI. And they advised us on what it is that we should be doing and how we should be communicating about our research. And it became really clear the first time I went to meet them that I needed to explain when offering a webinar what I mean by an evidence review. But not only that, what do I even mean by evidence? So actually, pieces of evidence can be lots of different outputs that come from a piece of research. So you might expect to see reports published by different government authorities or different researchers. And academics, we all like to write journal articles that sit in academic journals that maybe aren't very accessible to a general public. Lots of us collect data that we put into data sets that we use to analyze our findings, or indeed to reanalyze the findings of others. And by researchers, I mean academics like myself and Jack and Cian, but also other organizations do research that influence how technology is used. And these might include charities and civil society organizations or areas of government. So they might do that research in-house, or they may ask academics or non-academic researchers to do this research. So actually, explaining what evidence is takes quite a long time because it's a whole bunch of different people with different aims, different motivations, producing different kinds of things. So what we did, we reviewed 320 pieces of evidence that we reviewed, and they all claimed in some way to capture public experiences or understanding and perceptions of, or people's feelings, hopes and aspirations of what AI is. So now I'm going to try and demonstrate the webtoon. So it's quite hard demonstrating a webtoon because you read them vertically when, of course, standard slides present vertically. So apologies for the somewhat clunky presentation. This is my first attempt. But here's me and Sarah Canizzaro, who worked with me on the evidence review, really surrounded by lots and lots of pieces of evidence, all of these reports and reviews and so on, that were trying to capture people's hopes and fears of AI. And so we gathered them all together and stored them in one big data set. But we couldn't expect the researchers that we wanted our work to be shared with, or indeed the decision makers that we hoped to listen to us, to read all these individual pieces of evidence that we'd spent so long gathering together. So in fact, what you do is you condense all this information down, you group together statements from people who are similar or from research that was done in a similar way to kind of make the amount of information that you're sharing smaller and smaller and smaller, until it becomes this thing that's easy to read by different audiences. Ideally, public people like yourself who might attend a webinar, as well as these people in power that we want to listen to us, to include people's voices in AI. So here we have one of our narrators from the webtoon saying, brilliant, so these decision makers, so they can hear what we've all got to say. And his co-host is like, well, yeah, but actually this can be a bit complicated. Every study has its own goals. It will ask its own questions that will be the same or slightly different, and it will have its own audiences. And by this, I mean, it will have its own people that it wants to influence and the people that it wants to speak to. So this is where the difficulty of doing an evidence review of such a huge amount of different types of evidence comes in. And the crux of the reason behind doing an evidence review is this: can we trust the evidence? So we talk a lot about public trust in AI, or whether people trust different kinds of technologies, but actually, can we trust what people are saying is people's opinions and their hopes and fears and aspirations? So that's why we went about the huge task of reviewing all of these pieces of evidence together. So then, why an evidence review? Well, we knew as a big group of expert researchers that quite a lot of research was already in existence for what different people thought about AI. But what we didn't know were the differences about the research as a whole. We didn't know how different people were doing this research and how they were presenting their findings. We also know, as researchers, that we all have our favorite methods. We all have our ways of doing things, the ways that we think about the world that we call theories, and how we would approach public opinion and attitudes research. There's also disagreements in how to do inclusion well, i.e. if you want to speak to particular groups who perhaps are less represented in an evidence base, like how is the best way to think about speaking to these people? There are differences of opinion in terms of the kind of the philosophy and the ethics behind all of this. The other thing that's different about our evidence review is when you're reviewing previous research, such as pieces of literature and reports and so on, you tend to synthesize findings so that we can know what is already known about something. Now, the other thing about the way that these reviews tend to be done is through a process of exclusion. So you can really understand 20 to 50 pieces of literature in depth. And you know that these pieces of literature are robust and that they're believable and trustworthy and so on. But the key thing here is when you're really interested about including different kinds of people from different backgrounds with different experiences, sometimes there are arguments on what's the best research to include. So if you want to understand public opinion from the UK, you obviously want research that's spoken to loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of people. But oftentimes the best research to really understand how a particular community feels about something will be with a far smaller group of people, with people who are real experts at communicating with those groups. And so often these kinds of studies, because they have smaller samples, will not make it into an evidence review. So that's quite an important point behind why we did what we did. So our evidence review then is a step towards some form of assurance of including diverse voices and assurance of quality in the evidence. Because evidence tells us what we know about something and it influences people's decisions and the discussions around AI. So who is making evidence affects who gets in the room to influence decisions. And we thought it was really important to understand who was including who. So Sara Cannizzaro spent most of a year categorizing these 320 pieces of evidence in terms of which researchers said what, in what way, how did they report their findings, how did they do their research. But the other side of the who in this, of course, is who are the people they spoke to? Who was asked what questions about what and in what way? So we tried to map the similarities and differences across all of the who's on both sides of the research, the people doing the asking and the people being asked. So some other questions we were interested in then was what research makes good evidence? And how does that affect what we know and what we get to influence? How much does the existing research that's being counted as evidence account for inequalities or indeed account for differences? To what extent are inequalities and sensitivities to them accounted for when designing research? And how successful are people at inviting and including different people? Not very. Anyway, I'm giving away all the answers. So then, an overly simplistic way of presenting this in terms of who found what is we found a whole bunch of people decided to report that people were generally positive about AI with some ambivalence. And I'm just going to make a quick side comment on ambivalence because it's one of my bugbears. Quite often, researchers will say the public is ambivalent. Well, not all of the public is the same. Some people are really positive and some people are really negative. And saying the public is ambivalent is a way of obscuring the differences in opinion and the differences across society. So one of my bugbears is let's stop saying it's ambivalent because it's easy. Anyway, what we found was an overwhelming group of the researchers in the evidence base were reporting positive responses. And this tended to be from researchers who were positive about AI themselves, crucially because they were probably involved in developing it or building it themselves. So it was unlikely that they were, going to find that people didn't like this product that they'd spent 5 years building. Now, on the other side of the fence, or indeed, as Kitty's shown, this game of tug and war, those of us who are more concerned about the social impacts of AI tended to find more concern in when they were asking people. So, crucially, why are there such differences of opinion? And it's, what's interesting, I think, one of the things that Cian's about to say, I imagine, is that we were expecting AI researchers to perhaps be less concerned about the social impacts of AI than we actually found. So we know that those people who are developing AI are concerned about their social impacts. But what's interesting is maybe we don't know, and maybe Cian can tell us, whether these AI researchers are more concerned about the big scary things, social impacts of research, but they maybe don't consider the things that they're doing on a smaller scale as being harmful in the same way, but also that we're all just more inclined to take our own beliefs into the research that we do. And that's something that we have to remember when we're interpreting evidence, is that no matter how hard you try as a robust and neutral researcher, your beliefs will always affect the way you frame your findings. So meanwhile, that left us on a project that was aiming to place people, particularly those who were underrepresented, front and center of the AI conversations. Are these people really front and center in the evidence base as it stands, or are the people doing and making the evidence front and center? In terms of the evidence gaps and who is represented in the evidence and who is misrepresented, I'm just going to spend some time with this quote on the left. So, demographic traits explained the most variance in comfort with AI. Now, we would hope to find this. It was one of the hypotheses of the project. Like the survey of the general public decided to capture lots of data on people's demographic traits so that we could better understand how people's social origins and their experiences affected their aspirations and hopes and fears for AI. But the second part of the quote is the one that's interesting, because the way that the findings have been presented is that men and those with higher perceived technology competence were more comfortable with AI. Now, it's not that this isn't true, but the way that it's framed will encourage a decision maker to solve the problem by increasing technology competence, as in fact was announced by the government yesterday with all of this money going into AI skills, rather than focusing on why certain parts of society felt less comfortable. So that is kind of one of these tensions that we were really keen to make sure was clear. Okay, so then what else is happening in the evidence? Unfortunately, we found little evidence in the evidence of diverse populations. So it may well be that people spoke to targeted specific groups, but there was actually not that much evidence of representing the diversity of diverse populations in the evidence that we reviewed. We also found lots of examples of what we call inclusion washing. Now, what we mean by this is kind of taking tokenistic aspects of including people to be instrumental with your research, to target specific marginalized groups, to suggest that they accept something. So an example that always stands out in my head for some reason is trialing AI-enabled breast cancer screening software on Black women only, to understand how Black women do or do not accept this technology over white women. We also saw a boost to sampling. Now, again, this is a good thing. And again, we did it in the Public Voices in AI survey of however many thousands of people we spoke to. We oversampled from particular marginalized groups in order to make sure that there were more of those people who were included in our data collection. But what we saw in the evidence from other people's research was that when this happened, there was demographic data that was collected, more people were spoken to, but they weren't really included in the analysis or indeed thought about in the research design. So this is kind of going out and asking loads of people, but not really listening to them and not really doing much with their opinions. And finally, this then ending up with them being excluded from the headline findings, such as the example where instead of talking about how people who felt uncomfortable with AI were really feeling, the researchers in the quote on the left chose to talk about like how men feel. So yeah, again, grr. So then to move towards summing up and finishing, what we really wanted to do with this evidence review was get at the quality of the evidence, what we need to make arguments for certain parts of society, and to assure that public voices are included and included well. So good evidence is good at including people, especially those who are overlooked. And by including, we mean inviting. Don't force people to be included in research, just for the sake of it. But also, when you're doing this research, be sensitive to the needs of diverse groups. Think about how you're phrasing your questions or how you're designing your focus groups that really addresses some of the needs or the cultural sensitivities that you may need to speak to certain parts of society. Think about how to incorporate the differences that you've discovered when you're collecting demographic data in your analyses, and how to report on the importance of inequalities and differences in your findings. And finally, when you're going about gathering together all of these public opinions and all these pieces of research, reflect on how you're serving the communities that you've spoken to and how you're communicating their diverse perspectives clearly in recommendations so that they come across and they get to actually influence decision makers. So thanks everyone to listening to me and watching me grapple with how to present a webtoon. And I just also want to quickly thank the People's Panel in AI. Here's Margaret and Sharif on the right at BBC Sheffield talking about their experiences on the Public Voices in AI project, because it was with their encouragement that we decided to think about how to present our research findings differently. So thank you very much, and I will hand over to Cian.
Thanks, Susan. Just before we do, so if anybody does want to ask Susan anything quickly, you have just a few seconds to pop something in the Q&A. Susan, I'll hold on to my question until after Ian has spoken, maybe, and maybe it makes sense to do the whole discussion. But please do gather your thoughts. Any of you, put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that we have time to discuss them. And yes, thanks, Kitty, seeing as you're here. Thank you for the amazing illustrations. Lovely to see them for the first time. Yeah. Ian, I'm going to hand over to you to present the results from the survey of AI researchers.
Great stuff. Excellent. Thanks for setting that up. And let me continue with some public voices for a second before I get into the researcher voices. And as Jack said at the top, the majority of what I'm going to talk about comes from a survey we did as part of this Public Voices in AI project over the last year of the people in a way closest to AI development, the researchers themselves who are building models, who are thinking about vision, who are thinking about algorithms and large language models and things like that. But let's stick with the public. A couple of months ago, it was a lunchtime. I walked across Euston Road from where I work here at UCL in central London, and I walked up to the lovely, shiny, redeveloped canal side where there are now lots of technology firms in central London. Big glass offices, tall buildings. It was a beautiful spring day. And here are definitely some members of the public outside the offices of Meta on that day. And so that continued. Meta book thieves, in case that wasn't clear. That was a video I took quickly. There was about 150, usually very mild-mannered authors, novelists, illustrators standing outside of Meta, Facebook's, Instagram, WhatsApp's offices. And and fairly loud, relatively polite as these things go, but certainly very emotional and very vigorous protest organized by the Society of Authors. So what's going on here? One author who I talked to, Miranda, had told me that 2 weeks previously, she had been sent, ironically enough, a WhatsApp message with a link to an article in the US magazine, The Atlantic. And The Atlantic had something of an expose piece in which they accounted for how researchers, scientists, engineers, technologists at Meta had used pirated copies of millions of books and tens of millions of academic articles to essentially train their AI models. And this, for many of the authors, this had been late breaking news. I talked to people who had spent a lifetime writing books, illustrating, as I said, and using a tool provided in this article by The Atlantic, had found out that indeed many of their books, dozens in some cases, had been, those very books had been used by Meta scientists. What's the problem here? Well, a lot of people might say AI is new. We're uncharted territory. We've got an unregulated space here, but there are plenty of laws on copyright. There's plenty of laws on fair use. We kind of obey these laws when we go to libraries. And for many of these authors, they thought there's a settlement here. It's hard work as an author unless you're a really big name, but I've managed to make it work, and I get paid a certain amount of money for that, whether it's from library use, whether it's from people going into Waterstones or their local independent bookstore and doing that. These authors felt protected and their world was upended. So that was pretty shocking for them. It's especially interesting for us, I think, in thinking about what the people inside this building are doing as we're going through processes of say, the government, for instance, thinking about regulation, thinking about the data use and access bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, and thinking for us as academics about who should be responsible for this, who should be accountable. I guess the thing I want to say about these folks is they firmly think the folks responsible and accountable are inside the office here and hurrying in through lunch. As Jack said at the start, often technology is, and what we might call the governance, the rules around technology is framed as something that is best left to the experts. But we know from studying the history of emerging technologies over decades and decades and decades, that's not often the case. And there's two groups of people often left out of these debates. The first is, as Susan has covered, are the public. And another, we probably think intersecting group here, ironically enough, are the scientists and technology developers themselves. As Jack said at the top, it's often the owners, the CEOs, the very loud voices who dominate a discussion, and leave out the folks who make up the majority of the people working in buildings like this. So we wanted to know a little bit more of these people. To what extent their views line up with the views of different members of the public, different groups in society, much of which we know about from previous surveys and previous work done by organizations like the Alan Turing Institute, our partners in this, and indeed the Ada Lovelace Institute. So I'm going to cover, in the next few minutes, I'm going to cover just a few of the questions we asked, really to tee up some conversations, I hope, on that. So a little bit about the survey. This is what we might call a convenience sample survey with English language. So you've got to be able to understand English or use a translator to respond to us. We really cared about people who were actively engaged in doing the science and doing the engineering. So the location we used to find these people was a website called Archive. Archive has become one of the most important places where AI scientists publish early preprints, they call them, early work of emerging ideas on their work. So we emailed approximately 100,000 of these folks this time last year. And we had a final data set after all the responses were in of about 4,200 people. I'll talk you through maybe some of the top level stuff on that now. As I said, about 4,000 responses. The majority were male, self-reporting as male. This is in line with numbers we think in the industry to begin with. So that tells us something. Most of our respondents worked in universities, places like UCL, where I am today. There was not a major difference in many of the attitudes we had coming back from respondents in the UK from global attitudes. And as you can see there, the USA really dominated in terms of where our AI developers were coming from. Again, English language is an important part of this. Archive as well, our source for this sample is based in the US too. So some background there on who took part in the survey. Let me tell you give you some results then. And we'll post a link to the full survey report in the box as we go. This is really important, I think. This is something of an optimism gap when we look at what we know about members of the public and what they think about AI. For the most part, 54% of the researchers who responded see more benefits than risks from AI. But this makes sense, right? This is their jobs. This is what they've trained to do. Most of our respondents had advanced degrees, like master's degrees and PhDs. So a long-term commitment to this. The important part of this, I think, is that the same group of people are also worried about risks. And the risks that that our researchers are worried about tally up with risks that we've seen in prior research that members of the public might share. There's a couple of reasons that this is important. One of these reasons is that discussions by the loudest voices often hinge on certain kinds of risks, which carry with them certain kinds of policy responses, certain ways of governing AI, such as existential risks, such as fears of AI overlords and existential safety concerns and so on. When we looked at actually what worries our AI researchers, and this is work in progress that we're still looking into, we see, as well as some of those existential risks, maybe much more mundane, much more common concerns that we would find, say, amongst that group of people outside Meta's offices. Concerns about jobs and skilling, concerns about misinformation, concerns about misuse and malicious use. So not only do these kind of broad diversity of risks tell us there's a whole range of things that researchers are concerned with, they also tell us that they're lining up in different ways with members of the public. Okay, so we've established that there's a mix, there's the kind of sense of difference there. Who should be responsible for ensuring then that AI is used safely? I think the story of this graph that I really want to kind of get across is first that there continues to be a message of let's leave it to the experts. If we look at the bottom of the graph, our AI researchers, remember, are working in universities, who are working in firms, who are working in the public service, are telling us that, one, the companies developing the AI technology should be the ones ensuring safety. And two, the government after that. Number three, international standards bodies, all different forms of what we might call kind of expert views. When we go back and compare this, now they're very different samples, different people responding. We have to be very careful with these kind of comparisons. But when we compare this to what we do know about what members of the public, and in this case, members of the public in the UK, have said about who should be responsible for ensuring AI is used safely, we see a different picture emerging. In this case, we can kind of compare how much, say, members of the public favor an independent regulator versus kind of their trust or their responsibility they would want to place in firms. So we think that's kind of important. More work to be done in understanding those differences. So we don't want to assume people are thinking and researchers are thinking of those responsibilities in specific ways that aren't stated in the question. Okay. One of the issues I think that is at stake here is what AI researchers think about the public. One of the things we wanted to know was, how much the public understand AI, and if they understood AI more, if the public understood AI more, better, would they trust it more? And this is a really important question because it represents something of what we might call a deficit logic. The logic being that, hey, if we simply tell the public more about AI, if we give them information that they don't have, but they're going to trust this. The uptake will be stronger. We'll have a better diffusion throughout society. And certainly that's one of the things we're seeing here, is that kind of deficit logic is coming out quite strongly along the way. The last major diagram I want to show you, an illustration I want to show you here, relates a little bit back to the broader remit of the project we were working on, and the Public Values in AI project, and some of the things Susan said. And here we were kind of concerned with, okay, if you're sharing some of the fears and concerns maybe about AI with the public, if you agree that there's some of the risks here, do you have knowledge of methods by which the public might want to be involved in this? And this in the production of AI research. And this goes back to one of the motivations Jack mentioned at the start, which was along the lines of kind of a democratic decision-making, a democratic governance, democratic innovation here. If we think that there are implications, both benefits and risks for the public, shouldn't we involve people in decisions about how those technologies emerge, who benefits, who doesn't benefit, and so on? So when we asked researchers who said yes, in other questions they said yes, we think there should be some involvement by the public in research and development. They told us, well, that involvement should typically be downstream. It should be where technologies are diffused and where they come into the public, not in in maybe what they might call fundamental research away from the public. That was the first important finding. What this particular graph tells us, though, is that the knowledge by which researchers might come to learn about the public through methods such as surveys, reinforcement learning, focus groups, and so on, is situated very differently amongst researchers. And in particular, methods that might allow researchers to work with members of the public and really give them a say in the direction of that research, in the who benefits type of questions, and how, citizens' juries, deliberative processes that really ask meaty questions. Knowledge about those kind of methods was really low amongst our respondents. That may be no surprise. For the most part, these were computer scientists. But nevertheless, if we want to open up ideas about innovation, it's important that these methods or methods like this are probably diffused and taught and so on. Okay. Let's come back to the very to the issue I came in on, and the last point I want to make here before drawing some conclusions. When we asked researchers what data should there be limitations on the data you use? Should the internet be a free-for-all? Is it okay to hoover up kind of knowledge and data from different websites, be they legal or illegal? Only 1 in 4 researchers said to us in their responses that they think AI companies should be free to use all available data to train their models. In other words, 3 of 4, 3/4 of the researchers said, look, there should be some sort of limitations. There should be some sort of fair use policies, we might say. This is really important for these bills that are currently going through Parliament. It's a really important question, I think, for what we know is delayed now governance on AI more generally. And it says to us there's some more work to be done to understand where these views are coming from, and why maybe that the views of more powerful lobbyists who maybe present the internet as a free-for-all that should be fair game, why they should not be so dominant maybe in actual decisions. So some thoughts just to get the conversation going. The researchers that responded to us and the public agree on AI risks to some extent, but disagree about who should be responsible for its safe use. More work to be done there. There's a really important set of results in the report about different groups within our 4,000 respondents, and say grouped by location, grouped by gender, who then in turn report kind of very different perspectives on risks and responsibilities and regulation and governance. That's really important too. Responsibility is not an obligation. It is an obligation indeed. It's not a technological feature. We might think about that in the training and kind of work that we do with computer scientists and other AI technologists. And there's I think most hopefully some opportunity here in what we show of a kind of a willingness for many of the respondents here to say, yeah, we're up for engaging with members of the public and so on. Let's get on with doing that. So that's all I want to say. Some various different bits and pieces there for you to reflect on. And as I said, hopefully that report, we'll put that link to that report in the sidebar. That's it. Jack, back to you.
Thanks, Cian. Yeah, I've just put that link is there in the chat, so I hope everybody can see that. So yeah, just while I'm talking, anybody please do add anything in the Q&A, any questions or thoughts generated from either Cian or Susan's talk. Cian, we've got one question here, which is a really interesting question. So you mentioned that we had a very, very male dominated sample. The question is about whether we can learn something from what women responding to the survey thought, and whether that tells us anything. I can't, off the top of my head, remember those sort of demographic nuances, but can you say something about that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna kind of preface this by saying, please have a look at the report. We've got a couple of things in the report about this, and I'm semi-scared of getting this slightly wrong. But I will say one thing. That I made a point right in the last slide that that folks in the report, who we might think are marginalized by structures or rules, regulations in society, which includes sometimes women, reported different concerns, statistically significant different concerns about risks and about how those risks should be governed and managed. And we did ask questions about marginalized communities, marginalized people, and so the cross correlation of, say, gender and those questions did tell us some interesting things. I'm going to stop it there because I think it's in the report. Go and have a look. The short answer to that question is yes.
So there is something that we can learn. And
yes,
as the person who asked that question has put in the Q&A, yeah, absolutely. It speaks to Susan's presentation about who is researching, right? That the evidence opinions don't come from nowhere. I mean, it tells you something about the standpoints of the people who are getting that impression, which, you know, we all need to think about when we do this sort of survey work, which is, rather than treating these people as one homogenous mass, we look for the differences within these samples as well. We've got another question, Cian. I'm afraid just another quick one.
Yeah.
Oh, now they're all coming in. And so, what happens next? Plans? What do you want to do with this?
Initial report out. We are going to much more depth at the moment, Jack, as you know, because you're involved with it, in thinking about responsibilities. So kind of layering up a little bit. We have some open text responses there specifically that we are now taking seriously and looking across the survey with them. And I think those differentiated responsibilities, both within the researchers themselves and how they really relate to different groups in society, is really important to bring out.
Thanks, Cian. Susan, a couple for you. So a really interesting question here. There's a tendency identified by the questioner that, you know, it's very easy to say more research required in all of these things, especially when it comes to evidence for policy. If you are, say, a policymaker or a company, it's quite easy to say, well, you know, we can see that some people might think this, but we need to know more about X before we act. So, I mean, one might point to issues like climate change, for example, where it's been quite easy for policymakers over decades to say more research is needed, especially if they're trying to avoid taking action on something. How do we deal with that? So, you know, what counts as persuasive evidence? How do we deal with the fact that there will always be a demand for more evidence before people take steps that maybe they don't want to take? Oh, you're on mute, Susan.
There we go. Sorry, I love this question, Nancy, and you're speaking my language. So yes, how do we make these people accountable? And how do we stop producing evidence that essentially doesn't really do anything? Completely agree. However, can I answer your question? How do we move from one thing to the next? That is something that we're kind of grappling with in, you know, the Public Voices in AI as a project finished 3 or 4 months ago, but we are still as a group coming together to talk about how we can move the conversation forward from more research is needed to how to make people accountable in terms of thinking about who gets included and who gets missed out when decisions are made. So yeah, that answers your question, although I think I didn't answer Jack's version of your question, probably.
No, I will have mangled Nancy's question in my retelling. So that's great. Can I put the other one to you as well, Lucy, and
Yes.
then get your thoughts on this, Cian? So the question here is, you know, we're asking people what do they think about AI? We're looking for evidence about AI. AI is a slippery term. It means different things to different people. It means different things to experts involved in, for whom this is their job, to the rest of us who maybe have come across these systems, tried using one, you know, a couple of times. How do we deal with the flexibility of that concept? Susan, how did you address that in the evidence review?
So we decided to include both the idea of AI in general, as well as often very, very specific use cases. So like a very specific new system that was being trialed on a particular population. So I think it's important that we don't stop researching how people feel about this idea of AI as this kind of somewhat like not very useful term that kind of just lumps everything together and ignores what's the technical aspects, and sometimes privileges the technical aspects, ignoring the social, and sometimes vice versa, whilst also thinking that obviously what makes up AI are these very specific technologies, very specific use cases with very different impacts on different parts of society. So I think we need both. That's my answer. I fudged it. Over to you.
And just as a follow-up, Cian, before I get you to answer that one, just as a follow-up, do we have any findings about specific types of AI from the evidence review? I mean, it was asked about in the surveys. Can we learn anything about, say, AI in healthcare, AI in education that changes what the evidence looks like?
Yes, but we also have to remember that there is, for example, far more research on AI in healthcare. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One of the reasons for this is it's an easier thing for people to think about than maybe other domains of public services or welfare or their general lives that are maybe more bespoke. So thinking about AI in healthcare, it's more easy to imagine how it impacts on you and impacts on other people. But also, there's lots of money in AI in health, right? So that also skews the amount of evidence that we have. So I suppose while I don't want to make the case for just making more evidence, it's about the evidence that's being considered. So it's also about populations that aren't being studied. Like the global majority was horrendously underrepresented in our 320 sample. Now, that is not through a lack of trying, but it is actually to do with how, researchers find research by other researchers and in fact, AI-driven search systems that lead us to those studies. So yes, I fudged it again, but there we go. I'm conscious of running out of time. Sorry, Sorry, Cian.
Cian, can I put to you this question about whether AI is a useful term? What we gain and what we lose by using that term rather than talking about more specific applications and uses?
Yeah, I would. I again, because this is what I'm trying to do, I turn this around and say, who's it useful to, and in what way is AI useful? And I'm going to keep it short and say that. To follow up, then I think Lucy's question might be the most important question. Is AI useful as something we use to talk about, say, interventions in a health system, interventions in an education system, interventions in agriculture? Is it useful to change inequalities, absences, neglect in those systems? Or is it useful to keep things the same as they are and protect already established interests? Now, of course, there's a whole range of different things in the middle there, but that's one way for me of getting at that question. Who's AI useful to in that way?
Thanks, Cian. So we've got one more. We just a last call for any questions. We're just coming up on time now, but we've got one more here, which is, so Susan, you made the point about, we're dealing with very uncertain things here, which is why, and you made the argument that necessitates very different sorts of evidence. The evidence doesn't just plonk itself on your desk. Here, the question relates to a debate that I think a few of us are concerned with, to do with misinformation, right? To do with our information ecosystem, the way that we are all now exposed to unreliable and contested information. The old shared sources of news and information are finding it harder to compete. How does the AI debate fit into that? I mean, is it the sort of thing where we see a lot of deliberate misinformation? Is there a lot of noise? How does the evidence cut through?
I think this is a really lovely way of framing it, because, one thing I've been grappling with is this insistence that we need more AI literacy, and that this literacy emphasis is on imparting some form of technical knowledge on like the stupid people that exist in our society, when really, it's also about people who are deploying and developing and making decisions about using AI, understanding the impact of AI in general, but also the stuff that they're actually working with or buying, right? So what we're seeing then in this production, or the economy of evidence production, is misinformation. And I just hadn't really ever thought about it as misinformation in this way, in the same way that you think about misinformation and disinformation on social media or whatever. So actually, I think it's a really lovely framing that I am going to be using. Thank you very much, anonymous attendee one. But I think what can the evidence do to cut through it? I suppose it's for me, the question is, it's not that all of the evidence I looked at was bad, but what needs challenging is the assumption that because a piece of evidence is produced by someone, it's credible, when of course the disinformation is produced by, some kind of mill in Russia or whatever to disseminate on Facebook to like some some unsuspecting idiots or whatever. However you're thinking of disinformation, I think is a really interesting an important point, is like, who gets credibility to say what's true and affect decisions and who doesn't, what gets counted as evidence, and just to be mindful that like everyone needs to be somewhat kind of dubious when they're reading something as facts. So yeah, I guess it's the pretension of authority, isn't it, that I'm interested in unpicking. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So one final one then from me, which is about the sort of big question of what role evidence can play. So one of the things that I'm concerned about with AI is that it's very easy for the people selling AI to say nothing that we think now counts, because in a year's time there will be new magical things. What we know now will therefore be redundant. And anyway, it's always been the aim of the tech industry not to ask people what they want and give it to them, but to reveal new magical possibilities to them that people always come around to. There's a Steve Jobs quote that I'm trying to put my finger on about not asking the customer what they want, but something, right? How do we, especially as sort of slow-moving academics taking time to generate and sift this evidence, does it matter in the end when the world of tech is moving so fast? Who wants to jump in? Susan.
Well, it goes down to what is AI and what what was included in the evidence review. The studies from 5 or 6 years ago were obsessed with autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, and actually what we've seen is that the way that people ask questions of other people about AI, the focus is on healthcare, or these kind of either things that are going to save lives or change lives in like kind of smaller, more mundane ways, like how do you feel about Alexa? So I think that what we're talking about here is it a normative question about how people feel about tech? Because yes, the systems and the technology itself might change, but how people feel about technological development and how it excludes or includes people is a question that's probably more stable. That's me quickly.
Yeah, for me, Jack,
Thanks,
that's a question of democracy. To say that more research is needed is not to say, hey, I'm a researcher, hand me some money, although, yeah. But it's to say that this is political absence and neglect of voices. And this project was concerned with voices in AI. The value of doing the kind of research that we might think is absent is that that's a social process. That process brings people together. We get to look around and say, are you thinking what I'm thinking? How come we're on the outside here? And that maybe there's a theory of change, and there's a theory of collective action in that. So that's my kind of hope for building that evidence.
Can I just say one more thing, is that there's this assumption that people don't want to be asked about AI because they don't understand it, but actually it's an incredibly engaging topic. So Another way of looking at it is that the topic of AI is a good way of asking people questions about how they feel about society and the world they want to live in.
That's a really, really nice thought-provoking point to end on. Thank you both. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Cian. Thank you also, Kitty, for the illustrations. Thank you, Margaret, who was also here, a member of the People's Panel, who has been devoting lots of her time and attention to these questions of AI. And thank you finally to Ruth, who has been in the background organising us and setting this all up and making sure that we're all in the right place. And thank you all for joining. I hope it's been a useful discussion. Please do keep in touch with any of us.